The sun was beginning to set as Shaquille O'Neal drove along a long, quiet highway. After a long day of travel, he was ready for a break. He spotted a small gas station on the side of the road and decided to pull in. The station was located in a peaceful, rural town, far away from the noise and hustle of city life. It was a place that seemed stuck in time, with only a few cars parked in the lot. Shaq parked his car next to the single gas pump. The place was calm and quiet, with no rush of people or noise. The only sound was the gentle hum of the gas pump and the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. The convenience store had a flickering sign, and the shelves inside looked stocked with the basics: soda, snacks, and even a few spare tires. The setting sun bathed everything in a warm, golden light, adding to the peaceful, almost movie-like feel of the place. Shaq got out of the car, stretching his legs and looking around, ready to take a quick break before continuing his journey. It was a quiet evening at the small, rural gas station. The air was filled with the faint scent of gasoline and the warm glow of the setting sun. Shaquille O'Neal had just pulled up in his car, looking for a much-needed break after hours of driving. He had spent most of the day on the road, and the peace and quiet of this little station were exactly what he needed. As he stepped out of his vehicle, he stretched his legs, taking in the calm surroundings. He hadn't expected much, just a quick stop to refuel and get back on the road. But things quickly changed when a few fans recognized him. As Shaq made his way toward the gas pump, a couple of teenagers spotted him. Their eyes widened in disbelief. They whispered to each other before one of them, a young boy with wide, excited eyes, ran up to Shaq. Are you Shaquille O'Neal?" the boy stammered, his voice full of awe. Shaq looked down with a warm smile and nodded, "That's me, buddy." In an instant, the small crowd gathered around him. Teenagers, adults, even a few older folks came out of the convenience store. Phones came out of pockets, eager for a photo with the famous basketball player. Shaq, ever the gracious celebrity, smiled and obliged. He signed autographs, posed for selfies, and chatted with everyone who approached him. His large frame, usually a figure of intimidation on the court, was softened by his friendly demeanor. He was relaxed, down-to-earth, and happy to interact with the people who admired him. As he posed for a selfie with a young couple, Shaq spotted a small boy standing a little farther off, clutching a sign that read, "You're my champion," in bold, colorful letters. Shaq's heart warmed at the sight. He walked over to the boy, crouching down to his level. "You made this for me?" Shaq asked, pointing at the sign with a smile. The boy nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, I watch all your games. You're the best wrestler, basketball player ever." Shaq chuckled softly, pulling the boy into a side hug for a quick photo. "Thanks, champ," Shaq said with a wink. "You're the real MVP here. Never give up, okay?" As the crowd continued to snap pictures and share stories, the atmosphere was light-hearted, full of admiration and excitement. Shaq was clearly enjoying himself, as were the fans who were lucky enough to meet him. But not everyone at the gas station shared the same enthusiasm. At the far end of the parking lot, a group of bikers sat on their bikes, watching the scene unfold. They were part of the notorious Rattlesnake Riders, a rough-and-tumble gang with a reputation for causing trouble wherever they went. The gang's leader, Roy, was a tall, burly man with a thick beard and a snake tattoo curling around his neck. His eyes narrowed as he watched Shaq laughing and talking with the crowd. He didn't share the same admiration for the basketball star. In fact, Roy was openly disgusted by the attention Shaq was getting. "Look at this guy," Roy muttered to his gang, loud enough for the others to hear. "Mr. Big Shot, out here signing autographs like he's some kind of hero." One of the bikers, a scruffy man with a thick leather vest, snorted. "Yeah, all show, no go. Bet he wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real fight." Roy smirked and took a long drag from his cigarette, flicking the ashes onto the ground. He eyed Shaq from a distance, a sneer forming on his face. He wasn't impressed by the celebrity. To him, Shaq was just another Hollywood tough guy who liked to play pretend on the basketball court but probably didn't have the guts to back it up off of it. "Let's go introduce ourselves," Roy said, tossing his cigarette on the ground and grinding it under his boot. "I'm dying to see if the great Shaquille O'Neal is as tough as he pretends to be on TV." The bikers exchanged glances, nodding in agreement. They walked slowly toward the crowd, their boots crunching against the gravel. The atmosphere in the parking lot shifted instantly. The fans who had been excitedly chatting with Shaq began to sense the tension. Some of them hesitated, taking a few steps back as the bikers closed in. Shaq, still surrounded by fans, didn't immediately notice the bikers approaching. He was busy talking to a mother and her daughter, asking them about their favorite basketball team. But he couldn't help but feel the change in energy around him. The air felt heavier, as if something was about to happen. Roy and his gang reached the edge of the group. Roy took a moment to assess Shaq before speaking, his voice dripping with mockery. Well, if it isn't the champ himself," Roy said, his voice loud enough for Shaq to hear. "Out here playing superhero for the kiddies, huh?" Shaq turned, his friendly smile fading slightly as he looked up at Roy and the other bikers. He didn't flinch, but he could feel the hostility radiating off them. "I'm just out here minding my own business," Shaq replied calmly, trying to keep things light. "You guys should try it sometime." The bikers erupted in laughter, mocking him further. Roy stepped closer, towering over Shaq, his face twisted into a sneer. "You think you're tough, don't you? All those fancy moves in the ring. Bet they wouldn't mean squat in a real fight," Roy taunted, his voice low and threatening. Shaq, who was used to being taunted in one way or another, didn't rise to the bait. He kept his posture relaxed, but his eyes narrowed slightly. His calm demeanor was unshaken, but the warning signs of trouble were clear. Shaq took a deep breath, his voice even. "I'm not looking for trouble, man. How about we just let it go?" But Roy wasn't interested in peace. He took another step forward, his smirk widening. "What's the matter, champ?" Roy mocked. "Afraid? Or maybe you're just another Hollywood fake." Shaq's face remained calm. He wasn't afraid of Roy, but he knew that this wasn't the time to escalate things. However, the tension was rising, and he could sense that something more was coming. Despite the bikers' taunts and insults, Shaquille O'Neal maintained his composure. Standing tall, his imposing figure was matched only by his calm demeanor. He had dealt with plenty of hecklers and disrespect in his long career, both on and off the basketball court, but he wasn't about to let these bikers get under his skin. He stood there, smiling at the fans who had gathered around him, signing autographs and posing for selfies. His actions remained friendly and approachable, showing no sign of aggression, despite the insults coming from the group of bikers. Shaq, still surrounded by fans, didn't immediately notice the bikers approaching. He was busy talking to a mother and her daughter, asking them about their favorite basketball team. But he couldn't help but feel the change in energy around him. The air felt heavier, as if something was about to happen. Roy and his gang reached the edge of the group. Roy took a moment to assess Shaq before speaking, his voice dripping with mockery. Well, if it isn't the champ himself," Roy said, his voice loud enough for Shaq to hear. "Out here playing superhero for the kiddies, huh?" Shaq turned, his friendly smile fading slightly as he looked up at Roy and the other bikers. He didn't flinch, but he could feel the hostility radiating off them. "I'm just out here minding my own business," Shaq replied calmly, trying to keep things light. "You guys should try it sometime." The bikers erupted in laughter, mocking him further. Roy stepped closer, towering over Shaq, his face twisted into a sneer. "You think you're tough, don't you? All those fancy moves in the ring. Bet they wouldn't mean squat in a real fight," Roy taunted, his voice low and threatening. Shaq, who was used to being taunted in one way or another, didn't rise to the bait. He kept his posture relaxed, but his eyes narrowed slightly. His calm demeanor was unshaken, but the warning signs of trouble were clear. Shaq took a deep breath, his voice even. "I'm not looking for trouble, man. How about we just let it go?" But Roy wasn't interested in peace. He took another step forward, his smirk widening. "What's the matter, champ?" Roy mocked. "Afraid? Or maybe you're just another Hollywood fake." Shaq's face remained calm. He wasn't afraid of Roy, but he knew that this wasn't the time to escalate things. However, the tension was rising, and he could sense that something more was coming. Despite the bikers' taunts and insults, Shaquille O'Neal maintained his composure. Standing tall, his imposing figure was matched only by his calm demeanor. He had dealt with plenty of hecklers and disrespect in his long career, both on and off the basketball court, but he wasn't about to let these bikers get under his skin. He stood there, smiling at the fans who had gathered around him, signing autographs and posing for selfies. His actions remained friendly and approachable, showing no sign of aggression, despite the insults coming from the group of bikers. The more Shaq ignored the bikers, the angrier they seemed to get. Roy, the leader of the notorious Rattlesnake Riders, watched Shaq's calm reaction with growing frustration. His eyes narrowed, and a sneer crossed his face as he exchanged looks with his fellow gang members. Roy didn't like being ignored, especially by someone he thought was just a celebrity with no real toughness behind the fame. Shaq's lack of response was only making Roy more determined to provoke him. "Hey, big guy!" Roy called out, his voice laced with mockery. "You're out here signing autographs for these kids, but can you handle yourself outside of the ring?" Roy took a few steps closer, his boots crunching on the gravel, his posture challenging. "All that tough guy act in front of a crowd, but I bet you'd run from a real fight. You're just a Hollywood fake." Shaq didn't flinch. He remained in the same relaxed stance, still chatting with the fans. His attention was fully on the people he was interacting with. He knew what Roy was trying to do. He wanted to escalate things, get a reaction out of him, but Shaq wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. Roy, now growing impatient, took another step forward. His voice was louder this time, dripping with contempt. "What, you too scared to show us what you can do? You're all show, no go. Bet you couldn't fight your way out of a paper bag without those cameras following you around. Prove us wrong, champ." The taunts were getting more personal, but Shaq didn't take the bait. Instead, he took a deep breath, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and firm. "I'm not here for a fight, man. I'm just trying to enjoy my day. I'm not looking for trouble, and I'm sure you're not either." Roy's expression twisted in disbelief. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. He wanted to see Shaq get angry, to show some kind of weakness he could exploit. But Shaq stood his ground, unfazed by the insults. Shaq continued, his voice even but authoritative, "Why don't we just leave it here, huh? You do your thing, I'll do mine. No need to make this a big deal." For a moment, there was silence between them. The other bikers, who had been watching the exchange, were unsure of what to do. They could see that Roy wasn't getting the rise out of Shaq that he had hoped for. Roy's anger simmered as he glared at Shaq, his fists clenching and unclenching by his sides. Shaq's posture was calm, but his eyes were firm. He wasn't afraid of Roy, nor was he intimidated by his gang. Shaq knew that getting physical wasn't the answer. He didn't need to prove anything to these men. What mattered was maintaining his integrity and setting boundaries. "Look, man," Shaq said, his tone slightly softer but still assertive, "this is a good moment for you to walk away. I don't want trouble, but if you keep pushing, we'll be going in circles. Let's not make a mess out of this." Roy stood there for a second, his chest rising and falling with each breath. He was furious that Shaq wasn't biting. But as he looked at Shaq, who didn't budge an inch, something clicked in Roy's mind. This wasn't going anywhere. Roy, still furious that Shaq wasn't backing down, clenched his fists. His patience had worn thin, and he wasn't going to let this go. With a sneer on his face, he stepped forward, towering over Shaq. His voice was dripping with mockery as he taunted, "You think you're tough, huh? You think you can just stand here and play the hero for these kids? You're nothing more than a Hollywood fake, Shaq. All those fancy moves in the ring? They wouldn't mean a damn thing in a real fight. I bet you wouldn't last a minute with me and my crew." Shaq stood tall, his posture relaxed, but there was a steeliness in his eyes. He knew what Roy was trying to do. The taunts didn't faze him. He didn't need to prove anything. His silence was a statement in itself. He wasn't there to fight, and he wasn't going to give Roy the satisfaction of an angry outburst. But as Roy continued to taunt him, a small voice broke through the tension. "You leave him alone." A young boy, no older than 10, stepped forward from the crowd. His eyes were wide with determination, but there was a hint of fear. He clutched a sign that read, "You're my champion," in bold, colorful letters. The boy, clearly a fan of Shaq, looked up at the bikers with a mixture of defiance and admiration. "Shaq's my hero," the boy called out, his voice shaking slightly but full of conviction. "You're just bullies. Leave him alone." Roy's eyes narrowed as he turned his attention to the boy. His lips curled into a cruel grin, and he took a step closer to the young fan. "What's this? A little sidekick? Maybe we should teach you some respect, kid." Without warning, Roy raised his hand as if to strike the boy. The crowd gasped, and the tension in the air grew thick. The bikers, sensing an opportunity for chaos, laughed. They didn't see Shaq as a threat anymore, they saw an opportunity to humiliate him and show that no one was beyond their reach. But in an instant, Shaq moved. With the reflexes of a seasoned athlete, he stepped between the boy and Roy, blocking his path. The crowd fell silent, watching in awe as Shaq's towering presence shielded the boy. His voice, calm but firm, cut through the rising tension. "That's enough," Shaq said, his tone unwavering. His eyes locked onto Roy's, the words simple yet powerful. "You're not touching him." For a moment, Roy froze. The bikers, too, seemed to hesitate, taken aback by Shaq's sudden intervention. Shaq didn't raise his voice, but his presence alone was enough to stop the situation from spiraling further. He had set a clear boundary. No one was going to harm this boy on his watch. The moment Shaq stepped between the boy and Roy, the atmosphere shifted. The bikers, momentarily thrown off balance by Shaq's intervention, hesitated. The tension in the air was thick, and for a split second, it seemed as though Roy might back off. But that moment passed quickly. Roy, unwilling to show weakness in front of his gang, straightened his back, his smirk widening into a malicious grin. He wasn't done yet. If anything, Shaq's calm demeanor only seemed to fuel his desire to provoke. With a sneer, Roy took another step forward, his voice low but filled with mockery. "So, you think you're the tough guy, huh? Standing here like some kind of hero. But I'm betting you're too scared to do anything when it really matters." Shaq didn't react. His posture was relaxed, his eyes calm, but there was an alertness in his gaze that told Roy he wasn't intimidated. Shaq was used to being taunted, to being the target of jabs from people who didn't understand him. He'd faced much worse on the basketball court, and now, standing in front of these bikers, he wasn't about to let them get to him. Roy, seeing that his words weren't having the desired effect, took another step forward, his boots crunching loudly against the gravel. "What's wrong, big guy? Afraid to fight back? You all talk when the cameras are on, but I bet you wouldn't last 5 seconds in a real fight without your little entourage around. You can't hide behind that tough guy persona forever." Shaq's expression didn't change. He stood tall, his body language open but composed. He wasn't interested in getting physical with anyone, especially not for something as trivial as Roy's cheap shots. He gave Roy a look that said everything without saying a word. This wasn't the time, and this wasn't the place. Still, Roy wouldn't let it go. "You're not as tough as they say, are you? Just another fake. A show-off who needs the spotlight to feel important." The bikers circled around, closing in on Shaq, but he remained unfazed. He knew they were trying to bait him into a confrontation, to get him to act on impulse, but Shaq wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. His presence was calm, but there was a quiet intensity about him that made it clear he wouldn't let the situation get any worse. Roy's taunts continued, but Shaq's gaze never wavered. With a deep breath, he turned to walk away from the confrontation. But Roy wasn't finished. "What's the matter, huh? Too scared to stand up for yourself? Or maybe you're just too afraid to show the real you. I bet you're nothing without the cameras and the crowd." Shaq paused for a moment, his shoulders relaxing but his jaw tightening slightly. He was trying to walk away, trying to avoid escalation, but Roy was relentless. It was clear now, Roy wasn't just after a fight, he was trying to tear down Shaq's character, questioning his strength and his integrity. And as much as Shaq didn't want to engage in this senseless back and forth, he knew it was time to make one thing crystal clear: he wasn't going to let anyone, especially Roy, define who he was. The tension in the air was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Shaq could feel Roy's eyes burning into him, the mockery and insults growing louder by the second. But Shaq wasn't interested in a fight. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone, especially not to a group of bikers who were clearly looking for trouble. The taunts kept coming, but Shaq's calm demeanor never wavered. His years of experience dealing with hostility, on the court and off, taught him that the best way to handle a situation like this was with wisdom and restraint. Finally, after another round of taunts from Roy and the bikers, Shaq took a step back. His expression remained steady, his eyes unwavering as he locked onto Roy's. The anger in the air was almost palpable, but Shaq's voice cut through it like a calm breeze. "I'm not here to fight you," Shaq said, his tone even but firm. His words carried weight. "I'm just here to do the right thing. I'm not looking for trouble, and I'm sure you aren't either." His words were simple, but the conviction in his voice left no room for doubt. He wasn't about to escalate things, but at the same time, he wouldn't tolerate anyone threatening the people he cared about. Shaq wasn't afraid of physical confrontation, but he knew there was more to life than winning a fight. Sometimes, the strongest thing a person could do was to walk away. For a moment, there was silence. The bikers, who had been expecting Shaq to snap or throw a punch, were momentarily caught off guard by his response. Roy's smirk faltered as he processed the calmness in Shaq's voice. He had expected to break Shaq, to provoke him into some kind of aggressive reaction, but he hadn't gotten it. Shaq took another deep breath, his shoulders relaxed. He wasn't here to argue or make a scene. But the way Roy had continued to push him, taunting him for his character, made it clear that he wouldn't back down from standing his ground. Roy's frustration was palpable. He had wanted to see Shaq lose control, to show that he wasn't as tough as everyone made him out to be. But Shaq's response had been nothing like what he had anticipated. It wasn't the angry outburst he was hoping for. It wasn't the physical altercation he wanted to provoke. Instead, Shaq had shown nothing but composure and wisdom. Roy took a step back, his fists clenched at his sides. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the other bikers, then back at Shaq. The rest of his gang stood still, watching the scene unfold in silence. They had expected a show, a spectacle, but instead, they were left with nothing. It became clear to Roy that their intimidation tactics had failed. He let out a frustrated grunt, his jaw tightening. "Let's go," Roy growled, signaling to his gang. The bikers, sensing that the confrontation was over, slowly started to back off. The tension in the air began to lift as the group retreated, muttering curses under their breath as they got back on their bikes. Shaq's calm resolve had won the day. He hadn't needed to raise a fist or throw a punch. His wisdom and restraint had been enough to bring the situation to an end. Before Roy could turn away completely, Shaq spoke one final time, his voice steady and unyielding. "If you want to pick a fight, pick it with someone who's looking for one," he said, locking eyes with Roy one last time. "But I'm not your guy." With that, Shaq turned and began walking away. He moved toward the young boy, who had been standing on the sidelines, watching the entire scene unfold. Shaq gave him a reassuring smile, his large frame casting a protective shadow over the boy. "Hey, champ," Shaq said softly, crouching down to the boy's level. "Stay with your family, okay? You're safe now." The boy nodded, his eyes wide with admiration for the man who had just stood up to a group of bikers with nothing more than words. Shaq placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, offering a few final words of encouragement. "Remember, being brave isn't about fighting. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard." Shaq stood tall once again, his eyes scanning the remaining crowd. He had diffused the situation without violence, showing everyone around him that real strength came from restraint, wisdom, and standing firm in the face of adversity. As he made his way back to his car, the crowd slowly began to disperse, their respect for Shaq growing with each step he took. Shaq's calm strength had proven that sometimes, the best way to win a battle wasn't by fighting at all. As Shaq made his way back to his car, the tension in the air began to dissipate. The bikers, having retreated in defeat, were now nothing more than a distant memory. Shaq's calm demeanor had won the day, proving that strength wasn't always measured by physical power. The crowd that had gathered around the gas station, including the young boy who had witnessed the entire exchange, watched with admiration as Shaq got into his car. Without a word, Shaq started the engine, the soft rumble of his vehicle filling the quiet space. He glanced at the boy one last time, giving him a small, reassuring nod before pulling out of the lot. The crowd remained still, their eyes following him as he drove off into the golden hues of the setting sun. His large, powerful presence slowly faded from sight, but the impact of his actions lingered in the hearts and minds of everyone who had witnessed it. As Shaq's car disappeared down the road, the lesson of the day became clear to all: true strength isn't about physical power or violence, it's about restraint, wisdom, and standing up for what's right. Shaq's decision to not engage in violence, his calm words, and his willingness to protect the vulnerable left a mark on the people around him. He had proven that real heroes don't need to prove anything through force. Instead, they make the choice to act with integrity, patience, and respect. The bikers might have left the gas station with their heads hung low, but Shaq left behind something much more powerful, a lesson in courage, respect, and how to handle adversity with grace. The story would be remembered not for the fight that never happened, but for the hero who showed everyone that the greatest strength lies in choosing peace.